In the spring of 1988, a quiet apartment complex in Santee, California, became the center of a mystery that would haunt a family for more than 3 decades. Diane Lynn Dahn, a 29-year-old mother, worked as a radio repair technician for the San Diego Transit Corporation, a position seldom held by women at the time. She was known for her quick laugh, her love of music, and the fierce devotion she poured into raising her 2-year-old son, Mark. On the morning of May 2nd, a Monday, Diane failed to arrive for her shift. Her absence was so uncharacteristic that a worried coworker drove to her apartment on Graves Avenue after work. What they discovered set off a chain of events that would ripple through the years. Outside, little Mark was wandering alone through the courtyard, unable to articulate the horror he had witnessed. Inside, the scene was one of profound violence. Diane lay deceased in her bedroom, and there were no signs of forced entry, which suggested she had opened her door to someone she recognized. The brutality of the attack was staggering. Blunt force trauma and stab wounds to the chest indicated an intensely personal rage. Investigators from the San Diego County Sheriff's Homicide Unit immediately began canvassing the neighborhood, interviewing every possible witness. Yet no one could name a suspect or point to a clear motive. The silence that enveloped the case was as chilling as the crime itself. As the initial flurry of activity subsided, one fact remained. Somewhere, a killer was breathing, sleeping, and walking free, possibly just steps away from the very place where Diane had taken her final breath. The investigation, for all its urgency, quickly stalled. Detectives cataloged the physical evidence with painstaking care, and in doing so, they found 2-minute but potentially invaluable clues. Under Diane's fingernails, forensic specialists recovered skin cells that did not belong to her. More remarkable still, clutched tightly in her hand was a single strand of hair, yanked from her attacker's head during the desperate struggle for her life. In the late 1980s, DNA analysis was a nascent science, far from the sophisticated tool it would later become. The forensic team could do little more than preserve the hair and the scrapings in sterile containers, labeling them with a case number and a date, then placing them in cold storage. Those samples became a silent archive of the crime, waiting for a future that might never arrive. Meanwhile, the human toll was immediate and devastating. Diane's son, Mark Byer, was too young to process the loss and too young to supply detectives with even the smallest detail. He was adopted by a family friend, and though he was surrounded by love, the absence of his mother carved a hollow space in his life that nothing else could fill. For Diane's sister, Victoria Dawn Minter, the uncertainty became a slow, grinding torment. Each passing year deepened the wound, and the question who echoed through every family gathering, every birthday, every holiday. The case file never officially closed, but as the months stretched into years, the investigation grew cold, its pages gathering dust on a shelf marked unsolved. Time, often portrayed as a healer, brought only a festering grief to those who loved Diane. Victoria later confessed that the 34 years she spent not knowing nearly consumed her. She worried constantly that she and her parents would go to their graves without ever learning the identity of the person who had stolen her sister. Mark, growing up, felt the weight of an invisible shadow. He knew the basic facts of his mother's death, but the lack of resolution left him suspended in a strange, lonely place. In his own words, he sometimes felt alone all the time, even when surrounded by family who cared for him. Yet the San Diego County Sheriff's Department did not entirely forget. The cold case team periodically revisited the evidence, hoping that technological advancements might pry loose a secret that had remained stubbornly hidden. In October of 2000, 12 years after the murder, lab technicians managed to extract a partial DNA profile from the material under Diane's fingernails. It was a breakthrough, a whisper of progress, but the profile did not yield a suspect. A year later, in 2001, they attempted to enter it into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, only to hit a wall. The sample was insufficient to meet federal database standards. The whisper faded into silence, and once again hope was deferred. For the detectives who had dedicated countless hours to the case, the disappointment was sharp. They had touched the edge of an answer only to watch it slip away, leaving Diane's file exactly where it had been for a decade, open, cold, and waiting. In June of 2010, a renewed push brought the case back to the laboratory bench. Advances in DNA extraction and amplification had leaped forward in the intervening years, and this time, the technicians focused their attention on that single strand of hair. If the fingernail scrapings had yielded a faint signal, the hair root promised a much stronger one. The work was delicate and meticulous, but when it was complete, the result electrified the team. They had developed a full, robust DNA profile of the unknown male who had left that hair in Diane's hand. Even better, the new profile matched the earlier partial one taken from under her nails, confirming that both samples came from the same individual. With a complete genetic fingerprint in hand, investigators once again turned to CODIS, uploading the data with a renewed sense of certainty. They waited. The system hummed and searched, cross-referencing the profile against millions of convicted offenders and arrestees. But the screen came back empty. No match. The killer was not in the system. Later, they would learn that the killer's criminal record consisted only of minor property crimes, offenses that had never required him to submit a DNA sample. The ghost had no digital footprint. The disappointment was crushing. A meticulously assembled key had been crafted, but there was no lock for it to open. The silence that had stretched for 22 years seemed destined to last forever, a cold case threatening to become a frozen one. The years that followed 2010 were a quiet, stubborn holding pattern. The cold case team kept the file accessible, but the tools available to them seemed exhausted. Then, in May of 2020, a conversation began that would change everything. Detectives proposed using a still-emerging method that had recently cracked several high-profile cases, investigative genetic genealogy, or IgG. Unlike CODIS, which searches for a direct match among known offenders, IgG casts a much wider net. The process starts by uploading the unknown suspect's DNA profile to a public genealogy database, the kind where millions of people voluntarily share their genetic information to find distant cousins and trace their ancestry. Crucially, these databases require users to explicitly opt in to law enforcement access, ensuring that no one's privacy is breached without consent. The goal is not to find the killer himself. That would be astronomically unlikely. Instead, investigators hunt for a relative, a third cousin, a half-great aunt, anyone who shares enough DNA to indicate a blood connection. The work that follows is a monumental blend of genetics and old-fashioned detective labor. Genealogists construct vast family trees using public records to trace lineages back to a common ancestor and then forward to living descendants. The San Diego team uploaded the hair-derived profile and waited, hoping for a single flicker of genetic recognition. The flicker came. The upload produced a hit on a distant relative of the unknown suspect. It was a fragile thread, a connection so remote that most people would never know the person existed. But to the investigators, it was a lighthouse in a dark sea. From that single genetic cousin, senior crime intelligence analyst Jeff Vandersip and his team began the grueling work of building a genealogical forest. They started with that relative and branched outward, cross-referencing birth certificates, marriage licenses, death notices, and census records. The scale of the task was hard to overstate. By the time the team had finished mapping, they had identified and cataloged the lives of nearly 1,300 individuals, all connected to the unknown killer by blood or marriage. The next phase was elimination. They were hunting for a male who was the right age and who had been in Santee, California, in May of 1988. One by one, the 1,300 names were scrutinized. The forest shrank into a copse, then a single tree, and finally, one branch. On that branch sat a name, Warren Robertson. At the time of the murder, he was 28 years old. Born in Arkansas, Robertson had made his way to the San Diego area years earlier and was working as a tow truck driver. The detail that made the investigators' breath catch, however, was his address. In May of 1988, Warren Robertson lived in the very same apartment complex on Graves Avenue as Diane Dahn. He was her neighbor, residing just a few doors away. He had never appeared on the original suspect list. The first team of detectives had probably passed him in the parking lot without a second thought. Now, 32 years later, a name pulled from a sprawling family tree pointed directly at him. Still, genealogy is not proof. It is a map, not a verdict. The team needed a scientific confirmation that would hold up in a court of law, even if the suspect himself might never see a courtroom. They reached out to members of Robertson's immediate family, and those relatives voluntarily provided DNA samples. The lab ran the comparisons with painstaking care. When the results came back, they were definitive. The DNA from Robertson's kin confirmed, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the hair in Diane's hand and the skin under her nails belonged to Warren Robertson. The ghost had been given a name, a face, and an address. As investigators reconstructed Robertson's life around the time of the murder, a deeply unsettling picture began to form. While detectives could never establish that Diane and Robertson were acquaintances, they uncovered a shared interest that may have brought them into each other's orbit. Both were passionate fans of stock car racing and frequently attended events at the El Cajon Speedway, a local track not far from their apartment complex. It was a connection both ordinary and haunting. Two neighbors who might have stood in the same crowd, cheering the same race, one never suspecting the violence that lay dormant in the other. More incriminating than any shared hobby, however, was Robertson's behavior immediately after May 2, 1988. At the time, he lived in the complex with his wife. Soon after the murder, he abandoned her, gathering his things and moving to the nearby town of Lakeside, California. He did not stay long. By the end of 1989, he had fled the state entirely, relocating to Bartholomew County, Indiana. The sudden uprooting of his life, the abrupt severing of ties, and the distance he put between himself and San Diego all pointed to a man who was running. Investigators recognized it as a classic pattern of guilty flight, a subconscious admission written in geography rather than words. Robertson's flight did not lead to a dramatic capture. The investigative genetic genealogy breakthrough came in 2020, but when law enforcement went looking for their suspect, they found that they were more than 2 decades too late. On November 25, 1999, at the age of 39, Warren Robertson died in a house fire in Indiana. The flames that consumed his residence also erased any possibility of a trial, a confession, or a formal sentence. The man who had extinguished Diane Dahn's life with such ferocity had met his own end in an entirely different kind of inferno. For the detectives who had spent countless hours building the genealogical case, the news landed with a complicated mixture of vindication and frustration. The puzzle was solved, the identity confirmed, but the legal machinery of justice would never turn for Warren Robertson. There would be no courtroom confrontation, no gavel striking the sound block, no prison cell door sliding shut. Still, the investigation had achieved something profound. It had answered the question that had tortured a family for 34 years. The who was no longer a mystery. The why might be forever lost. But the truth, at last, was not. In March of 2022, the San Diego County Sheriff's Department held a press conference to announce that the murder of Diane Dahn had been officially solved. It was nearly 34 years to the day after her death, and just 2 weeks past what would have been her 63rd birthday. Standing before the cameras, investigators detailed the extraordinary journey that had led them to Warren Robertson. For Diane's family, the news brought a release that words could barely capture. Her sister Victoria spoke through tears, describing the decades of not knowing and the fear that she would die without an answer. She acknowledged that the pain did not vanish, but the answer had arrived. And that meant everything. Mark Byer, the little boy once found wandering alone, had grown into a man capable of articulating the strange isolation of a child shaped by unsolved tragedy. He marveled at the investigative work that had filled in the empty spaces of his history, and he spoke of closure not as a cure, but as a gift. Diane's case became the 5th cold case solved by the department using genetic genealogy, a milestone that underscored a new era in criminal investigation. Her killer had evaded handcuffs and a judge, but he could not evade the single strand of hair she held onto with her last strength. After 34 years, the silence was broken, and Diane Lynn Dahn was no longer a victim waiting for her story to be finished.